Welcome to the Odyssey of a Former Fat Kid. I'm your host and former fat kid, Bryan Butler, and today I have the privilege of having two guests, Jenny and Andy, who have agreed to join me so we can talk about the new U.S. nutrition guidelines. Jenny and Andy, thank you all so much for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you for
Thanks for
having
having us. Me.
Awesome. So for anyone who may not be aware, the current administration just released new nutrition guidelines for the general public, and there's been some celebration of them. There's been some criticism of them. They are changed from the previous guidelines. High level, the previous guidelines focused a lot on grains and things like that as a foundation, fruits and veggies, 6 to 11 servings of grains. It had, dairy and meat and things like that kind of towards the top of the pyramid. So the broader base meant greater consumption. The higher on the pyramid meant less consumption. So at the very top of that, you had, added sugars, alcohol, and things like that. The current administration flipped it in a sense visually, but not necessarily in the same way. So they have an inverted pyramid with a lot of fruits and veggies and whole foods and things like that at the top, along with whole fat dairies and meats. And then at the bottom, it's, grains and things like that. And they actually don't recommend sugar and alcohol at all, or alcohol is, consumed less, but sugar is not even on it as well. And so visually, they're not saying eat the same amount of meat as you're eating veggies, but it does communicate that. And so I have Jenny and Andy. Andy's a dietitian and prolific author, and specializes in fatty liver, as well as some other things. Jenny specializes in A1C and works with high performing individuals in the New York area, helping them manage that. And so I thought it'd be a great to have them both on and just kind of dig into this a bit. So let's start with Jenny. What are your like high level intro thoughts on the change?
I just feel that there's always a hyper focus on a macro or a group. And what I have seen work is balance. So before it was like, okay, like fat was the devil. Everything had to be low fat or no fat. And then a lot of the manufacturers started adding all the sugar. So now we're having a very high level of people with pre-diabetes and insulin resistance and all of that because they shied away from fat. And you could even remember how people would be like, don't eat the full egg, only eat the egg white. Like there was this hyper focus on fat. Now is the hyper focus on like carbs are horrible. And then, the Atkins diet and the carnivore. It's always this shift towards, okay, like let's focus on this. Now the new kid in the block is protein. Mind you, I as somebody that specializes with people that have blood sugar imbalances and diabetes and prediabetes, yes, protein is great. It helps you produce the famous GLP-1 hormone naturally. It has a bunch of benefits. It helps with, maintaining muscle and all of that. But what I'm seeing here is almost like, oh, now we're ditching other things that are good and are needed. Like, where's the fiber coming from? I have to constantly kind of like teach my clients that, okay, carbs are not just bad. It's just think about the proportions and the choices of carbs that you're using. You need carbs to produce serotonin. You need carbs for energy. So when I saw this, I'm like, okay, so it seems like it's a hyper focus on go for the full fat, go for like the meats. And I'm sure Andy's going to have thoughts on saturated fats. I'm going to let him, he's the dietitian expert, but it's almost like now we're tilting it towards something different. And what I have seen with my clients is that what actually becomes sustainable and creates results and improves their health is balance. It's like, okay, like how are you incorporating these food groups in a way that you're supporting your body, that you're feeling great, that you're hitting the weight management, that number that you want, and that the labs are working great, and that you feel optimal. And it's not about, okay, I'm going to go into this diet or that diet or
Mm-hmm.
hyper focus on one group. It's like, how can you incorporate all these groups? Because now I don't see much in terms of like even the sugar, right? Like before, it used to be, at least in the US, like 20 or 25 grams of like added sugar a day. I believe like now they say like zero, it's like don't have any, which I kind of like, and like that portion of it, because I had to eliminate. I don't have table sugar in my house. Like the only sources of sugar are natural sources of sugar. Now, if you want to incorporate some, I'm like, okay, do it, but how is everything else in your life, right? Like, can you
Mm-hmm.
incorporate that with moderation and still have balance, or are you just incorporating it in every single meal and exceeding that? But that's on the nutshell my take. And then the fact that years ago, the whole pyramid was eliminated and replaced for the plate method because it's easier for somebody to understand how am I going to plate my meals?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is the proportion? It's easier for you to say, okay, grab a plate, half a plate, make sure you have non starchy vegetables in it. Then put your protein here and put it's easier than to kind of like, okay, here's a pyramid, like, figure it out. Like, they still struggle with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know. I have more thoughts, but I'm not going to take over.
Andy, what are your kind of high level intro thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, in really simple terms, if you're offering broad public health guidance, I would hope that you would help people understand the foods that are playing maybe a big role or too big of a role versus the foods that are playing a smaller role in someone's diet. And now if you pluck an average person, quote unquote average person, I mean, they're much more likely to be getting, enough the saturated fat limit. They're much more likely to be having a large amount of red meat already. They're much less likely to be having, let's say, a large amount of fish or a large amount of whole grains or a large amount of nuts, vegetables, or beans, right? So the issue that I have is it doesn't convey that messaging. It doesn't offer a hierarchy that represents actually what's being over and under consumed in the general public. That's if I'm going to offer it simply, and we can dive into that as we discuss it. But simple terms, that's how I view it, right? The average person, because remember, an individual like my clients, they don't care about this. They're getting high level advice from me. People who have
Mm-hmm.
access to specialists, they're not going to think much about these guidelines. They have to have a conversation about it. But it's the most vulnerable people who have, realistically the least balanced diets and the least comprehension of nutrition science who are going to be most affected. I think that's reasonable to say. So are we really doing them a justice when we say eat, red meat is consumed much more than fish? Right. And we know if you can swap that intake level, you're going to get better health outcomes because you're going to reduce saturated fat, increase omega-3. Right. So, yeah, I mean, that's my high level thoughts.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, you mentioned some really interesting points, and you and I have talked a little bit about this too. I just checked in the U.S. The primary meat that's consumed now is chicken, and it surpassed beef in 2010. So it's on annual per capita, 100 pounds of chicken is consumed by an individual in a given year, and so we don't have the red meat concern in the same way that maybe we would have had a generation ago. And I think in large part that's been due to the heavy emphasis, to your point, Jenny, on saturated fat and reducing saturated fat. But we also know that chicken has some benefits, obviously, but there are certain important elements that, Andy, you talk about often, with the omega-3s and different things like that. And some of the good fats in fatty fish, like U.S. folks don't consume fish much at all, unless you live on the coast. If you're like New York or Seattle or something like that, or California, then you have access to regular fish. But most of us Midwesterners, fish is not a regular part of of our diet. And so it definitely leaves some gaps for us. Andy, can you talk a bit more? And I mean, Jenny, one of the things like in New York as well, about the importance of keeping in mind those who are most vulnerable. So, like the food guidelines are going to be heavily influenced what happens at schools and school lunches and things like that. Can you talk a bit more about just the importance of keeping that population in mind?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely some interesting things in the guidelines. I mean, you see the word like process comes up a lot, but
Mm-hmm.
interestingly, and it's more so in terms of, sugars, right? But they don't actually ever name, as far as I could tell in the summary document, they don't name processed meat. They dance around that, right? They kind of allude to maybe, but when we know, like, processed meat, for example, is one of the highest, like, risk increases for colorectal cancer, right? So that's really interesting as well. There's obviously a little bit of like gamifying going on, and then there's not an emphasis on saying, hey, like, it's okay to have, canned fish is a really great idea. Like, that's economical, accessible, things like that. That really concerns me. And then when you get into like the over demonization of sugar, then we get into an issue. Now, I have like a broad philosophy that, keeping in mind that fiber is underconsumed in the population, and we know small increase in fiber, relatively speaking, can totally change your trajectory and make you more full, right? Which is valuable, and protein does as well, of course. But I have a broad philosophy that like 1 gram of fiber is much more good for you than a gram of sugar is bad for you. So if we're teaching people that a cereal that has 8 grams of fiber and 8 grams of sugar is now bad, and they should have bacon, I don't know, I'm not saying it says this, but like, that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
Because I believe like a product that has 8 grams of fiber and 8 grams of sugar is very good and could change the trajectory of someone's health, and the sugar's in there just to make it not taste like absolute crap. So there's absolute room there for someone, right? Plus pushing whole grains down, and a lot of whole grain products like cereals or oatmeal, they will have a little bit of sugar added, but there will be a lot of fiber too. So that's like kind of like a deal with the devil type of thing that I don't think is in the best interest of the general public. And like, it's not rocket science. I mean, we know that like chips and muffins and pretzels, like, these aren't superfoods. I don't know that anyone's under that impression. And so people are really, you see a little bit on social media, people are saying like, oh, this is a massive win. And I don't know anyone who's really walking around thinking that, but I don't know. I already made the point, so I don't want to repeat myself. But I don't think people walking around thinking that those were ever superfoods or those were ever championed as superfoods, right? So there's a lot of issues there.
Yeah, Jenny, what? So one of the things that I haven't had direct experience with myself, when it comes to national food guidelines and its application in schools, I was homeschooled all the way up through high school. And so like we ate at home. And then our kids are kind of like a hybrid, but even the language school that they're at, there is an emphasis on more healthy whole foods as opposed to the prepackaged foods. But we've used some terms like processed before, and that can be one of those where different people mean different things by what do we mean by when we say processed meats, and how processed is not good. Kind of where does that line?
I always tell clients, because sometimes process can be like, okay, if I buy something in a can, is it good or bad? Or again, you mentioned like tuna. Tuna is like one of the best sources. It has a lot of protein. It's accessible. It's not super expensive. So, okay, like, how is it? Look at the ingredients. If you cannot read them, then start questioning, what in the world is that? Even sugar. Let's talk about even the sugar part. There are like 50 or 60 different names of types of sugar that can be squeezed in there. So if you're looking for sugar alone, you're like, oh, this has no sugar. It's okay. Well, but it has a bunch of other stuff. So try to get things as close to their natural state and look at the ingredients. If it has tons of ingredients that you cannot even read, then start questioning, like, okay, do I have an alternative? Some people, even with frozen vegetables, a lot of people are like, oh, but frozen is not good. I'm like, you know what? Frozen vegetables may be the one thing that you have accessible, and that may be the one way that you can incorporate it. You could do a stir fry, and it is processed in a sense that is packaged. But look at the ingredients. There's some that actually add sugar and add other things into it. So looking at the ingredients and trying to incorporate things closer to their natural source is always best. But it doesn't mean that if you get canned beans, they're bad just because they're canned. I think it's better having the canned beans and rinse them and think about the BPA and all these other stuff than not having them at all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good strategy for folks to keep in mind as well. And I mean, from a meat standpoint, I think, Andy, you were alluding to the fact that like deli meats and things like that, in particular, and the process that they go through can contribute significantly to like the colorectal cancer, increased chances of that and stuff like that. that type of processing of a meat versus, your ground beef, per se, your organic ground beef or something like that, which is processed, but not to the same extent.
For sure, and look, it's not to say that nobody can consume products like this, and there are different,
Right.
there's more products that come out that don't have, like, they have less of certain types of preservatives and so on. But
Hmm.
like, even looking at, I'm just going to pull a can of sardines as an example, right?
Yeah.
Now, like, if we think about like the quote unquote average person, like like economics is relevant, efficiency is relevant, what they're not doing enough is relevant. The chronic diseases that are most likely to affect them are relevant. So if you think of a can of sardines, you think about the nutrients that are most underconsumed in like North America. Okay,
Hmm.
vitamin D, omega-3, magnesium, calcium. A can of sardines with the bones, which is one of the most affordable forms of protein, has all of the above. Now, a can of sardines, by the way, has the same amount of calcium as a cup of milk, and that amount of calcium, which you add on to, and then there's nothing wrong, nothing wrong with dairy, and we could talk about the saturated fat in dairy and what I think about that, but the amount of the amount of calcium in can of sardines is 300 milligrams. That amount is generally associated, if you have that per day, if you're eating not eating enough calcium, that's 17% risk in colorectal cancer. And we know that colorectal cancer rates are rapidly increasing, especially amongst young people. And it's the one type of cancer that you can modify you can reduce your risk the most via diet, where these guidelines are basically saying, let's have more red meat, dance around processed meat, don't name them specifically, kind of allude to maybe they're not good, but don't call them out by name, which I found interesting. Have alcohol in social settings, and like, again, to each their own, but those are risk increasing behaviors. And if we go back to this like general public guidance, you can, these higher ups and these elite influencers who sleep well, work out, they're very smart. Like, they do, they eat fiber, whether or not they show you or not. Like, they eat, they're not, these are not stupid people, right? Maybe they don't eat kale because they don't like it, they think it has pesticides, but they're eating fiber. They're smart enough. They see what the research shows. Okay, they're doing these things. They're exercising often. So even if they get a slight risk increase because they love their red meat, they're doing so many protective things. But is the average person engaged in all those protective behaviors? And it's fair for us to tell them that because I do it, you can do it? I don't believe it is. I don't believe it is, right? And that's just the fact of the matter.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good point. It reminds me of there's not related to nutrition, but like, let's say, related to choices that can improve the outcomes, in your life as a whole. So there are some public figures who will be proponents of, I'll just say it. They'll be proponents of extramarital or premarital sex. They'll be proponents of um, certain types of education. They'll be proponents of not getting married. But then you look at their life, and they're married.
Mm-hmm.
They're in a committed relationship. Their kids go to a private school. They eat differently and behave differently. Some of them don't even drink alcohol, even though if you look at their public persona, it's what they champion. They may even have businesses in it and stuff like that. And just reminds me of a similar effect of, you'll have folks who have the ability, if you will, the privilege to get enough sleep, have a really specific diet, work out enough, minimize stress, all these things. And then they'll say, if I can do it, you can do it too. But to your point, the general public is living very differently. And the strategies that we need to make available to them need to take that into account and be applicable for them. Otherwise, you're just kind of beating them over the head with do this, but you don't have the means to actually achieve this. And that's probably
Yeah.
one of the goals that I have for this as well, is like, as we talk about it, kind of what are some like just ground level strategies that people can take into account, whether it be the canned food and how you can think about that and change your thinking, frozen vegetables, don't demonize those. That's a very viable, way to get your fiber and other micronutrients and things like that in as well. So yeah, just being able to provide people with options to improve their life. We've mentioned chronic illness a few different times, whether colorectal cancer as well. But with the increase in diabetes and hypertension and things like that, how is our diet affecting us? Like, how did we get here? Obviously, we can't just blame it all on um, packaged foods, if you will. But what are some of the things that you've identified with working with your clients and seeing trends that have might be contributing factors to this increase in chronic illness that we're all seem to be navigating?
Jenny, you can
A
go
lot of
first.
a lot of it has to do with access, right? Like
Okay.
I am lucky that I work with like executives, right? Like they do have the resources, but at the same time, I try to work with the community so that people that don't have those resources, they can actually incorporate those things because it's all about habits. Some of them, okay, like they're cultural aspects that you need to take into consideration. I grew up eating this. I don't know how to cook. You'll be surprised. Of like people are like, okay, how do I prep this the right way? And sometimes they don't
Mm,
like certain vegetables, and it's not that they don't necessarily not like them. They just don't even know how to prep, or it's easier. Or again, processed foods tends to be cheaper. So if you're in a budget, you're gonna try to gravitate towards the frozen stuff. And yet with a little bit of education, they can shift that and see, like, oh, wait a minute, like eating healthier doesn't necessarily mean that you have to pay a lot more for it. That is almost a misconception. But a lot of it has to do with education and demystifying the fact that in order for you to exercise, you need to have a gym membership,
mm,
or it has to be 2 hours, or you need a personal trainer, and I cannot afford that. When
mhm.
there are so many other resources, there is walking. I know that Andy mentions that a lot. A lot of my clients, when they come to me, they're like, oh, but I need to do this high intensity workout. It has to be. There is always this extreme, and they brush off simple, sustainable strategies that actually, when you stick with them, then they actually generate those results, right? Like nobody develops diabetes overnight. And I tell that to my clients. You didn't become overweight, you didn't get the A1C levels skyrocketing overnight. It was something that you have been doing sustainable, and your body has been building that resistance. So now it's going to take time for you to kind of like circle back and improve that. So getting into the point of, okay, how can I incorporate exercise in the way that it fits my life and my schedule? Because sometimes it may be just looking for a video on YouTube and or putting a playlist and dancing with your kids because that's all you can do. Um, Incorporating things that brings you joy and incorporate movement. Maybe you like biking, maybe you like swimming, other things that you can incorporate. So the same thing with foods. Sometimes I'm like, okay, like they focus so much on what they cannot eat. Oh, like, okay, bread is bad, or I
Mhm.
cannot eat this. I know this is bad. And you have to shift it as to, okay, like, what about, again, the fiber? That's like the one thing that a lot of people don't eat. A lot of people eat protein. Protein is actually easier for you to get people to eat. But then when it comes to the fiber, when it comes to even the fruits, because they're afraid of the carbs, the carbs are going
Mm,
to get me. And shifting that and exploring and actually finding things that they enjoy instead of saying you need to eat broccoli because broccoli is delicious, and maybe they hate broccoli, and I'm like, okay, there are a bunch of other vegetables. Sometimes I assign to my clients, I'm like, okay, like this week pick a color and that's what we do, pick a color and pick a vegetable of that color and incorporate that. And if you don't
mm.
like it this week, then next week pick another one until you find 4 or 5 that you really enjoy, and that's how they end up incorporating that. So it's incorporating these things that are simple and sustainable versus giving them a myriad of things. Most people know that they need to exercise, they need to drink water, they need to sleep more.
Mm,
It's
mhm.
it's from knowing and for that information into how do I fit that in my life? How do I
Yeah.
make my entire family be on board? Because I may like broccoli, but my kids are going to spit it out. What do I do? Do I need to cook 3 things?
Yep.
And how is that going to be sustainable? So those are the
Yeah.
challenges that I see, and that's what I try to do even when I give talks in the community, because
Hmm.
not everybody can afford a health coach, or not everybody can afford like to have a personal trainer and all these access to different things, but they
Right.
can still work on their health and do it effectively.
Absolutely. Okay. How about
Yeah,
you,
and I
Andy?
mean, excuse me, and yeah, and those are great points. And I mean, to your initial point, Brian. I mean, I think like There's a few things I'll say. I mean, simply, if you're talking about hypertension, high blood pressure, and then pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, well, on the one hand, you have high sodium intake, which again is readily for certain types of processed, readily accessible foods. Like, and again, using the processed term broadly here because it's a complicated term. And then on the other hand, higher glycemic index carbohydrates, things made from white flour generally, particularly in the absence of balanced meals, which is another criticism of the food guide, which doesn't really teach how to assemble a meal, right? A quote unquote balanced meal. So I think, high glycemic index carbohydrates, high sodium, very often those can cross over, right? And then bigger picture right in the middle, you have a lack of physical activity. Right. Which is a big issue, which is why I speak so much, to Jenny's point, why I speak about walking so much, because for myself personally, I don't care to give to give guidance to someone to do 5% better at high rocks. Right. Like those people are okay. They're going to be okay no matter what if they get a silver or bronze medal. Right. In their little sport. Right. I care about someone who is in the most challenging position. And how can we make them believe that actually their health is in their hands? And that's why I talk about walking so much, because it's not easy to go, especially if you're a little bit older. It's tough. So I try to offer easy workout guides, etc. And then we have this other broad reality. Okay, which is really interesting. It is true. The more energy you expend physically, the more carbohydrates technically you need. Right? Generally, that's true in sports and physical activity. But what's not being taken into consideration is, even if you don't expend energy, you still need to get enough fiber. So by overly demonizing foods that give you fiber, because maybe they have a little bit of sugar, because they're grains, then we get into this problematic area. So those two things are both true. And that messaging is not easy to deliver. And certainly I don't think it was well delivered in these guidelines. Okay, so that's what I would also say.
Okay, awesome. Regarding fiber, no doubt most people think about fiber. Most people don't think about fiber until they get older. And then when they think about fiber, it's like, oh, get your prunes or get your
supplements,
your Miralax, or something like that.
Supplements. Everybody that I work with, the moment that I'm like, okay, like, how are you doing with your fiber? It's like, it's okay. I'm just going to get the supplement. I'm like, okay, like, can we explore?
Some psyllium husk and mix it in and whatnot. So
psyllium is great, but it's only one piece of the puzzle.
Right. So
that's for sure.
Because the other side of that is people think fiber, they're going to think, veggies, but most often they're going to think lettuce and different things like that. So what foods have great sources of fiber that are typically not thought of when people think I need to consume more fiber?
I'll go first, Shannon. Right. I'm going to be quick.
I'm going to let the dietitian go first.
For me, it's like I identify with my clients and indirectly on social media. I don't say it directly, but there are 4 unique food groups. Okay, that if you strive to get them most days, you're very likely going to get a fiber, right? And those groups are, fruits. And by the way, each of these food groups is unique in other ways too, which is an additional incentive to get them because they offer you something that you cannot find somewhere else. Fruits, vegetables, what we might call healthy fats, which is nuts, seeds, avocado, and olives, and legumes, lentils, chickpeas, kidney beans, black beans, which I consider the most underappreciated food group and a food that, given how economic and accessible it is, I think could totally change someone's life if they ate them a little bit more regularly, because and there's many reasons for that, which we talk about. So if you And you could also tie in, like, let's just say someone doesn't like beans or eating beans daily is not on the table for digestive. You can tie in whole grains into that group, right? The quinoa, the brown rice, the whole grain bread of the world. If you're able to get one fruit from each of those groups, and realistically, I mean, there's going to be, realistically, we can get more than one, realistically speaking. But if you get at least one from each group, you are going to be in an amazing position to get enough fiber, and you're going to expose yourself to unique compounds, unique nutrients that right now you're not getting enough of. So independent of how much red meat you want to eat and hitting your protein target, that's all great. This still has to be accomplished, in my view, if we're having an honest look at like the types of dietary strategies that offer the best blood work, the most longevity, the best health markers, and all of that good stuff. So that's how I look at it.
Okay. Jenny?
Yeah. I mean, similarly, like, do cover the groups. What I typically tell my clients, like, okay, how do you build a plate that has balance? It's like protein, fiber, and fat. Like I talk about it, like the PFF formula. So make sure you have some protein, make sure you have some fiber. And then and sometimes they will genuinely ask me, I'm like, okay, like, what does have fiber or how much fiber? And there are lists out there. Sometimes I'm like, okay, here is a list. Look at the list of fruits. We know apples and pears, like they have like 4 or 5 grams of fiber. So sometimes like you give them that information and look at what they already incorporate, and they can say, oh, okay, I didn't know that this had fiber. The same to your point. Like, yes, spinach is great. It has a lot of nutrients, but it doesn't have as much fiber as other hearty vegetables or whole grains. So demystifying that and thinking that, again, lettuce and tomato is like an amazing source of fiber. I'm like, they have some fiber, but they don't have that much. You need to put other things in there. So for them to realize that, and then, okay, let's build something and figure out what are some items that you already enjoy. How can we incorporate that? Fruit is like the one thing that a lot of people shy away again. The whole thing about carbs. I cannot have carbs. If there's one question that people ask me, it's like, can I eat fruit while I have diabetes? Like, they will ask that, and I'm like, okay, like that's actually one of the best sources versus drinking juice or soda or something like that. But to incorporate that, the nuts is like one thing. A lot of people sometimes when they eat their yogurt, I'm like, okay, like why don't you throw some chia seeds in there or ground flax seeds? Like find ways to incorporating that fiber. And I always tell them, be aware of how you feel. Because some of them will be like, oh, I only want to eat this. I'm like, okay, like, would you be open to testing it? How do you feel 2 hours after? The same way when they skip breakfast, I always tell them, like, okay, like, how do you feel during that day? Don't you feel a bit more towards like the cravings and getting grazing around? And then they realize, oh, okay, like when I make these choices, I feel so much better. Now I'm seeing a pattern. So incorporating that fiber and avoiding that blood sugar spike, you have to tell them, okay, look at your plate. Do you have protein? Do you have fiber? Do you have healthy fats in there? If not, figure out a way of balancing that plate and look at every meal that way. And that's how they have been able to incorporate all of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, from one of the interesting critiques of the, I think, old and new pyramids from a design perspective was the confusion that ensues from structuring the foods that way. Because to your point, there isn't any guidance on what an actual meal looks like. There's just these broad groups, and then you're just kind of left to fend for yourselves. And I'm sure you all even experience it with clients. If you just kind of give them this kind of overview, they're like, okay, yeah, that's great. But what does this look like in application in my life on a day to day basis? And neither pyramid really serves that purpose, even if they give percentages, So, like, I think with the new guidelines, they say consume your protein and your fats from like whole sources, but they also say still limit your saturated fat consumption to 10% a day. But that's still very kind of like abstract and non-concrete for the everyday person. With your clients, do you use visual aids at times? I guess from a standpoint of like, here's what a plate might look like, given your preferences and things like that, or do you have other methods for kind of guiding them through how they might think through assembling their meals on a day to day basis? We'll start with you, Andy.
I use the diabetes. I use the diabetes plate.
Okay.
And there is a Harvard plate as well because it is easier for them to visualize it. When you throw that pyramid, I mean, like the plate actually replaced the old pyramid. Like it came back and it came back inverted. It's just kind of funny, but it is easier for them to actually build it that way. Be like, okay, look at your plate. Nobody wants to be measuring. If you eat out, you won't be able to measure. So the only way is to visually figure out how can you make this plate balanced? How can I include the food groups that I need to? So I do use the visual aid, and sometimes I'm like, okay, like send me a picture, let me see. Like, okay, like what do you feel that, so that they can get used to that. Sometimes at the beginning, I would say, if you really want to know how much, if you're concerned about calories, which I kind of like, that's the last resource, and I leave that to their dietitian. But when it comes to that, okay, if you want to measure and make sure that, oh, I'm having 2 servings of this and not 4 because you didn't measure it for a couple of days until you visually can identify, okay, this is what a cup looks like, and then go from there. But it's more sustainable when you can visually see it and build your plate without having to be counting or having to use the scale or anything like that to figure out if what you're eating it's according to what you're targeting for.
Yeah,
Yeah, and fair enough. I think there's a few things there. I mean, it's true essentially how everyone's different, right? Nutrition's a game of each their own. But I mean, generally speaking, I think people eat meals and they eat snacks, and it's a fair case. Like you could argue a public health guidance could give more direction as to like how to assemble a strong meal, how to assemble a strong snack relative to the nutrients that people underconsume, right, or what they need more of. So that's definitely a fair point. And certainly, I mean, that's how I pretty much talk about nutrition with my clients. And there's a few layers, right? Like generally, for most people, and this is anecdotal, right? This is me just speaking to thousands of people or at least probably 1,000 people, hopefully maybe hundreds, whatever. But you have, breakfast is usually a little bit unique. Lunch and dinner are more similar to each other, and then snacks are snacks, right? So if we're talking like lunch or dinner, what I generally do, and I have the old school like plate model from Health Canada from years ago on my wall, which was half vegetables and then a quarter protein, quarter starch. What I generally kind of like, if I just give very high level guidance, like before we curate it, right, I might tell someone, let's aim for more a third of each component in the plate, because that's probably more like achievable. I think it's very hard for someone, especially if they're not used to eating vegetables or they're easing into it, to really expect someone's going to have half of their plate to be vegetables. Although for the right person, depending on their calorie needs and their protein needs, that could be the right choice and that could be the dream, right? But if I give high-level accessible guidance, I might say something like that. But of course, then we can refine it down to the individual. And to Jenny's point, I very frequently have my clients do food photo diaries where they take photos of their major meals, so I can make sure that the vision that I'm presenting to them, that they comprehend it and they bring it to life in the way that I want them to, right? And so I can assess the balance of the meal and so on. So that's what I would say to that.
Awesome. Okay. Food photo journal. That's good. That definitely keeps that'll keep you honest. This is gonna
much better than like in my opinion, like vastly superior. And to each their own. Nutrition is a game of each their own. So I'm not Aristotle here. I don't have philosophical speeches for everyone, but I just think it's vastly superior to like, especially for the average person with limited time and already too much burden mentally around food, and they need to defer those mental resources elsewhere. Food photojournal is just vastly superior to like a MyFitnessPal. But hey, someone could come on and make a strong case to the contrary, and fair enough, right? Teach their own.
Yeah. And it takes a lot of time also for you to type and incorporate each and every element. So then that discourages them. Taking a picture is easier.
Yeah, and I can assess it. Let me, like, rather than you guess how much you're eating and bend over backwards, let me look at it with my expertise and rapidly assess it, and then give you, it just makes more sense. And I mean, AI will get increasingly better. Inevitably, I think I saw Lane Norden, who's like, very accomplished individual in the nutrition space. He was basically saying AI is really not that great right now at doing that, but it's like almost like at some point it's going to get better and better, right, at doing stuff like that. So,
yeah. And I mean, admittedly too, I mean, after a previous conversation with you, Andy, there's a family member of mine who we're working with to help, hit some health goals. And she has a plethora of challenges, special needs and different hormonal things and stuff like that. And being able to utilize AI to help collate all of that data and kind of distill it down into some actionable steps was definitely very helpful. Definitely very helpful. And I can see how, as it continues to improve, but again, I guess to the point of, even with a tool like that, it's only as good as the inputs and the prompts, and so and your knowledge of utilizing the tool in that regard as well. So if you don't know what to ask it and what to plug in and how to refine it, then you're gonna get something wild.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Like, I mean, I could
Go
talk.
for it.
I mean, AI is best used by someone who like already has the knowledge base. There's no question. But if you're comparing, like, especially if you know how to use it, which I can't take for granted that anyone given person does. I mean, AI is probably going to give you a better answer than your cousin Jimmy at Thanksgiving dinner. Realistically, right? It's going to be less. It's going to be less prone to bias, right? It's going to be less prone to bias and anecdotal experience, and it's going to do a better job of collecting the scientific consensus on a topic. But I mean, look, it has limitations, and I'm not saying that go out and use AI for all your nutrition questions. I think in conjunction with support from an expert, it could be a useful tool. But it's not perfect. It has flaws, right? And those flaws, are more apparent in some settings than others. That goes without saying.
Yep, absolutely. Similarly to, I mean, the warning that some have given, I think with they made recent changes to ChatGPT that limit or eliminate the ability to use it as a counselor, because
Mm.
obviously for various reasons there were issues there as well. Um, for I know one of the reasons that processed foods became and are still like really popular, whether it be from a perceived accessibility perspective, or I think another important one is speed. Um, as you mentioned, like with the execs that you work with, you're pulling in a ton of different directions. You don't have a lot of bandwidth. You need something that is clear, actionable, requires very little mental energy to execute so that you can stay consistent with it. And obviously, fast food provides, um, which is typically highly processed as well, provides that speed solution to people. How can how do you counsel your patients, both of you, um, when kind of that overwhelm is a factor and you're helping them kind of create a strategy that is simple and actionable? How do you counsel them in that?
When it comes to coaching, right? Like you have that dream state. This is your
Hmm.
destination, but you can't just change 10 things at a time.
Yeah.
So again, by motivational interviewing, that's what we do, and behavioral, and okay, like what do you feel is like that first thing that you want to focus on? And Andy reflected that well in terms of vegetables. If you don't eat vegetables at all, and all of a sudden you tell them, okay, from now on, every single day, you're going to have your plate, half is going to be vegetables.
Yeah.
It's not going to work. So you have to see, okay, where do you feel like, okay, I want to start here, because they have to own it. Like I can only help them so much, and in the end, they have to make the changes. And then what are the resources? Like I have had people that they travel, and I'm like, okay, so they don't have a kitchen unless they reserve a room with a kitchen, and then they have to think about groceries and they have to think about other
Mm.
things. Sometimes that's not even possible,
Yeah.
but you know where you're going. You can look at the restaurants that are there, and sometimes we build a plan, and I'm like, okay, what can you control? Can you at least control the snacks? Every hotel has a gym room, so you could include some movement there, even if it is like it's all else. So we try to develop that and start again something that they can stick with and that is sustainable. Again, like if you're a high executive, you have an assistant, you are able to order here in New York, at least you do have options, and you have a lot of options to eat healthier. So
Hmm.
what are your preference? What are the things? Let's figure it out. If you have a Friday night, I had somebody that's like, oh, my family is complaining because we used to order pizza every Friday night, and now I cannot order pizza. I'm like,
Mm.
no, you can order pizza, but
Hmm.
let's figure this out. Okay, like what are you gonna eat? What are you putting on that pizza? How many slices? Are you having a side salad? Like what? How can we make it that you're balancing that plate? You're still enjoying and you're still spending time with your family, and they're not gonna resent you and your health journey. So
Yeah.
thinking about what is it that you want to do, but then focusing on one thing, mastering that, and then building from there. That is what I have seen that is something that is sustainable. And I always ask, can you see yourself doing this for the rest of your life?
Yeah. How
Like,
about you, Andy?
you enjoy
Oh,
this,
sorry.
and can you do it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I similarly, I'll tell my clients when I'm going to answer that question, Bryan, with a few things, but I'll tell my clients like your personal desires and preferences pretty much supersede anything else. Like you cannot do something that you hate for an extended period. I don't think that's reasonable. I wouldn't want to do it, and so I wouldn't extend that like sentiment to my clients. So I value what someone's willing and able to do very highly. So there's a
Hmm.
few things to say to your point. I mean, look, for $7 in 7 minutes, you can have a can of beans, a can of sardines, and a bag of frozen spinach, and that's processed by some definition. And there are actually 4 levels of processed foods, and I would encourage people to go look that up, and so they
Hmm.
can better understand like what that means. And there's pros and cons to that, but if anyone's really interested in this topic, look it up, and you'll see there's very different, like there's different levels, different categorizations. And I don't even think that the term is that useful realistically. But anyway, put that aside. I'd rather talk about polyphenols, which are wonderful things found in fruits with benefits. But you could grab that meal, you could pan fry it, and for $7 in 7 minutes, and you season it. I mean, look, I know it's not the most glamorous thing, but the amount of gaps that would fill, that would close someone's fiber gap. It would give you a full day supply of vitamin D and omega-3. It's pretty remarkable. It'll keep you very satiated. You could change someone's life by having that every day, right? It's not for everyone, that particular combination. But if you season it well, it could be tasty. So there's that. And then beyond, like, look, nutrition, as I said earlier, nutrition is a game of averages, right? So even if you talk about eating out, like a client can come to me and say, you know what, Andy, I want a vision for like really high level eating for myself, but I'm going to eat out every single day. And here are the 5 options I have. Okay, we work with that. Or I want to have a Snickers bar every afternoon. Of course, you can assemble a strong day of eating, even with those things being true, right? So that's where like personal preference kind of supersedes to a certain extent everything else. So yeah, that's what I would say to that. And when you get to the general public, it is tougher, which is why I try and force messaging, right? Like, when you look at, I shared a study recently, if you had to evaluate the likelihood someone is going to reach age 70 in good health, which means no cognitive impairment, no disease, no physical impairment. And let's say you had 2 criteria to judge them by: the amount of processed foods they eat, or if they eat a lot or low processed foods, or if they eat a lot of fish, beans, nuts, and fruit. So like basically like the balance and quality of their diet or processed foods. And when you look at high consumers of processed foods versus low consumers, like the percentage like risk associated with high processed food consumption is much less than the percentage benefit of a generally strong balanced diet, which tells me it's what you eat, not what you don't eat, that's the strongest predictor of your longevity and health. And that's an important message for people to hear. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, that's a great place to wrap it up. Thank you all again so much for being willing to hop on and discuss this. And like always, I'll have ways for people to reach out to you all and connect with you if they want to learn more about what you do, the resources that you have, or work with you. And yeah, the goal is that we all get a little smarter each day regarding our health and live better. All right.
We'll have to do it again soon.
Absolutely.
Nice to see you guys.
Thank you so much.
Yes. All right. Take care.